All right, we're going to talk about JavaScript objects. Technically, everything in JavaScript is an object. That's why on number literals and string literals, you can use the dot access or syntax to access something like the toString method. So everything in JavaScript is an object. We've talked a little bit about objects before, but now we're going to kind of go in depth about what that means and we're going to start creating our own objects. Okay, so I have a file on my desktop here called object literal. So that's where we're going to start. So what is an object literal? It basically means we're going to literally create the object in our code. Okay, so the syntax here is let person. All right, so person is our identifier. It's our variable name. This is an equal symbol. This is an assignment operation. So whenever you have assignment, the thing on the right is evaluated and then stored on in the identifier on the left. Okay, so here to create an object, we use curly brace syntax. Okay, and inside of the object, we can create properties. Right, so first for first name, and then you have a colon equals, then the value. So this is sort of like assignment, but it's inside of an object. So they call these properties. This is a property name and a property value. Okay, so this object has the property first, and then colon for assignment instead of equals with variables. All right, and then you have a comma to separate the next property name or key value pair. All right, so this is the name. Sometimes that's called a key, the property name, property key, colon, and then the value. All right, and then another comma. In JavaScript, you can have properties that have spaces or special characters, right? But if you do that, you have to put the key name in quotations, all right? And there are drawbacks to this as well. When you're trying to access this, you cannot use the dot notation. You have to use the square bracket notation to access these items, okay? So let's take a look at printing some of this stuff out, all right? So property access. Here I'm going to console.log. This is the standard way of printing something to the terminal in JavaScript. We have our object, right? So this is a reference to this object. When JavaScript sees this, it first has to go get this object from memory, all right? And then from that object, we're going to dot access a property on that object. And so dot access, what's the name of the property we want? First, so that's going to evaluate to the value John. All right, this is dot accessing syntax. You can also use square bracket accessors. Okay, so same idea, person. It's a reference to this item in memory. JavaScript retrieves that. We use square bracket syntax instead of the dot syntax, and we can just put in a string value. Right now, we cannot do this because that's an identifier, and this has not been defined. Okay, so this would just be, JavaScript would just be looking for the variable last, and we haven't defined one. We've only defined a property last on this object, okay? Now you can do this if we had a variable named last that held a string, right? But we don't in this case, all right? So person last, and then this way with full name, we have to use the square bracket syntax. And the reason for that is if we were to use the dot syntax, dot full name, JavaScript sees this space and it thinks it's moving on to a new identifier. Okay, so that's just part of the language of JavaScript. When you use the dot syntax, you cannot have spaces, where you can't have hyphens either, because Python would JavaScript would think that is a subtraction symbol. Okay. So we can't have that. If you're going to have special characters in your names, you have to use the square bracket syntax. And the square bracket syntax is also good for variable. If you have a variable holding a string, you can use that instead. All right, property access. All right, so let's run this. You can use the node command and then the name of the program. Okay, and we see John Doe and then John Doe. Pretty basic so far. Property access. So we have a problem here though, because we have the full name. The full name is dependent on the first and last name. Okay, so if I do something like this, I change the value of one of the properties. So first, then I log out the same stuff here, person.first, person.last, and then person full name. The problem here is we changed the first name, but full name hasn't changed, right? So this is an issue for us. Let's save this and see what this prints out. John Doe, that's correct, but then we change John to Bob Doe. So this is incorrect. So one of the problems here is that we're duplicating data unnecessarily. And this can be a big problem in databases and different things like that. You don't want to duplicate your data. In this case, the full name property should probably be a calculation of the first and last name. And that way, if you change either the first or the last name, it's automatically updated to be the correct value, right? And then you don't have data duplication, meaning you don't have to change it in two different locations, okay? So how does this work? Here we just printed out first, last, same exact stuff, but that just shows that we had a dependent property. Okay, so let's do a computed property. All right, so we'll paste some of this code in here so we don't have to watch me type it all out. Okay, computed properties, they basically call a function that will compute the property from the appropriate dependencies. So in this case, our dependencies are the first name and the last name. So sometimes these are called getters. You have the idea of setters and getters. They're functions that set a value or get a value. All right, here the this keyword is used. So we're going to be referencing the idea of this in objects quite a bit. The this keyword is used in a method. Okay, so a method is a function that's attached to an object. All right, so here we have an object, right? That's a curly brace syntax. We have assignment and curly brace syntax. Here are our properties, and here we have a property name, and the value of that property is a function. Okay, so that makes it a method because it's attached to the object. All right, this returns a reference to the object itself when used inside object methods. Okay, so we see inside of this function, we have a reference to this, unknown concept to us at this time, this. So this is a special keyword. It's a special identifier, and it references the object that a method, when used inside of a method, it references the object that that method is attached to. So this will reference this outer object. Okay, so now what we have is this dot first plus the empty string plus this dot last. So we are calculating this property or computing this property value, okay, from a function. So this is called a getter. We're going to get a value, and if we change either one of these, then when we execute this, it's going to calculate the correct value for us. So we don't have to maintain the data in two different places, right? And then we added an additional function onto this object. So that makes it a method because it's attached to the object, right? So there's an alternative way to define functions. Here we use the classic property name colon syntax, which is fine. And then we just specified a function. This by itself would be an anonymous function. Okay, so there's no function name associated with it. But since we set it to this property, that becomes the function name, right? But this code by itself is an anonymous function. And in JavaScript, you'll see anonymous functions all the time. You can pass in anonymous functions to other functions or methods, right? So this sort of syntax you'll see all the time. Now here is an alternative way to define a function on an object, and this is newer, and you just specify the property name, and then left and right parentheses and curly braces for the function body. Okay, and so any arguments would go in there if you had them. So this is just another way of doing that, and we can show we're going to access person2, right, which is going to access this object. We're going to use the dot accessor. So JavaScript's going to look on this object for something called print. Okay, it finds print. What is print storing? Well, it's storing a function. Okay, so at this point we have a function. When we use the left and right parentheses, then we invoke that function or call that function. All right, so this is important. This would just return the function itself, and this is what actually calls that function. All right, so we can run this again. I'll save my file. All right, and John Doe. Okay, so let's say we need to change the value here of one of our person2 properties. So person2 dot first. This time we want to make it Bob. Okay, so the idea is we want to print it out again, and we want the full name. So when we print, we're calling get full name. We want that to take into account of this change of the first name, and it should, because this is just going to calculate it. Okay, so we have John Doe, and then we changed it to Bob, and then automatically we get it for free because we used a getter, or a computed property, and Bob is automatically placed in the right location. Okay. Let's take a look at the next set of code. Okay. Now, one thing to note is we are using this up here inside of functions. Okay. So using this in an object literal definition outside of methods, which is what we're going to do down here, won't work. Okay, it's a common thing to try to do something like this, where you have a property name and then you use this, and the hope would be that this references this object, this outer object here. But that's not how this works. This has to be used inside of a function that is attached to an object. So this function is on the print property of the object. So this will reference the outer object. Okay, in this case, right here, full name is not a function. So this is not inside a method. So this is being run in its current context. So this would reference an outer object outside of all of this. And if there is no outer object, then this references the global variable. Okay. So the global variable you can think of as the global context. Okay, and you can store things on the global context. There's a lot of built-in things on the global context, like math.random, stuff like that. But we don't want to pollute the global context, okay? Because you could overwrite functionality on the global context. You could accidentally overwrite the math library or something like that. So generally, we don't want to do that. Okay, so note that when using this in an object literal definition outside of methods, it won't work because the context of this is not executing in a function attached to an object. So here it will work. This part is what won't. Instead, this will refer to the outer scope, since the object literal has not yet been created. So we haven't created this object, so there is no object for this to reference. We are in the process of creating the object. So this can't reference anything that doesn't already exist, right? So since we're in the process of creating this object, this can't reference the object yet. Now, why can it do it in the function? It's because we created the function when we created the object, but this was never called. That code was never reached. That's not reached until you call the function, at which point the object does exist, okay? So after you create the object, none of the methods have executed. So none of the keyword this has been encountered in any of those methods. All right. So that's why it can work in the function or the method case inside of the methods, but it can't work in the outer scope like this. All right. And so we can take a look at this and show that this doesn't work. Okay. So we see undefined when we're trying to get full name. Okay. So undefined. Now notice we didn't get an error here. We're trying to access a value first. Okay, so it doesn't give us an error retrieving this. So that means this actually does exist. There's something there. It's returning an object. And in JavaScript, when you try to access a property on an object that does not exist, it just returns undefined. So this is returning an object. It just happens to be the global object in this particular case. So global object, access the item, the value with the property name first, and JavaScript looks on the global object. Do we have a property named first? And we don't, so the value that gets returned is undefined. And JavaScript has no problem doing this sort of thing. It won't give you an error. It tries to run as much as possible. Even if you give it weird information or undefined values, it just keeps going. All right. So here we have undefined, and it has no problem adding a single space character to that and converting undefined to the string undefined, And then we have the same situation. This references the global object. We access .last. There is no property .last, so this returns undefined. Undefined itself is a data type, right? It's not a string, but because we have a string here, JavaScript uses coercion, and it coerces the value of undefined there and the value of undefined there to a string, because that's the only thing that makes sense with the plus symbol for these data types, right? It wouldn't make sense to try to do anything else. How would you convert a string to something with respect to undefined, and what does it even mean to add two undefineds together, right? So the only thing that makes sense is to convert this to a string and concatenate them. So that's what JavaScript does. And again, that's called coercion, type coercion. All right. And so we can run that. Oh, we already ran that. So the last little bit for this particular video that we want to talk about is this code here. All right, so the this keyword in an object method applies to the object on which the method resides and not necessarily the object where the function was defined. Okay, so let's unpack that. This keyword of an object in a method, it applies to the object on which the method resides, not necessarily the object where the function was defined. What this means is we can have methods that are attached to a particular object. So we have person4 get full name, and we have our previous person2, which is the good implementation of get full name. That's our getter here. So we've already defined this function get full name on person2, and we saw when we ran print, it got this dot get full name and returned the correct value, and it was in reference to person2 because that was where the method was attached. Okay, so in JavaScript, you can attach a method from another object onto a different object. So here we've got person4 that does not have a get full name function or method defined. So we define the property, and you can do this with objects. You can just arbitrarily add properties to objects after you've created them. Get full name, and then person2 dot get full name. So what we're doing here is we're setting this property equal to this function. So now if I call person4, I'm going to set the print function as well to person2.print. And now I'm going to call person4.print. All right. And if we do this, we have John Doe and then undefined because we changed it to Bob, right? And now we have Jane Doe, and this is our person4 object, and get full name now applies like right here. This is where we set this get full name function. We attached it to our person4 object. So now the this defined in this method is going to grab the object to which it's attached. Even though it was defined on person2, this is where we defined it, this always references where it's attached, not where it was defined. Okay, so now it's attached to person4, so when JavaScript encounters this keyword, it grabs the person4 object instead. Okay, and then down here we can we're just getting the full name function. If there is no object that the function is attached to, this is undefined. Okay, so this is an example where we're actually taking the function off of an object and we're just saving it in a variable. Okay, so now this variable is a function, right? But it's not attached to any objects. All right, so person4.getFullName, that is the function. Notice we did not have the left and right parentheses. That would invoke a function call. Here is just a reference to the function itself. All right, since it's attached to an object, we call that a method, but it's really just a function. They're all just functions. It's just whether or not it's attached to a method. So this function we save in a variable. Now this variable is not attached to any methods, so we just run the function, and in this way, this is going to be undefined, and it's actually the same thing as before. It's actually not undefined. It's the global context, but the value of finding this dot first, right? Dot first is not a property on the global context. Okay. So that's why we get undefined, undefined. All right, so that's the basics of object literals. Well, there's going to be several more files like this, and this is going to be how I kind of do things, where I kind of copy over the code so you don't have to wait for me to type it, and then kind of explain what's going on with objects. Okay, so several more videos to come. I'm going to try to keep these as short as possible so you can kind of digest them and look back at the different videos and search a little bit easier. Okay, so that's it for this one. Thanks for watching.